lights are killers, huh? Well, welcome to the Sylvester Baxter Lecture with David Lowenthal. I'm Susan Snyder, co-director of the Critical Conservation Program, along with Michael Hayes and George Thomas. This is the first GSD-wide event hosted by the new Critical Conservation Program. Critical Conservation is part of the Design Research Platform and the MDes degree program at GSD. And we want to thank Dean Mohsen Mostafavi's office and the Invents office at GSD for making this possible. Critical Conservation at GSD had its origins in Rem Koolhaas's Chrono-Chaos exhibit in 2010 that presciently warned the design field that, quote, preservation is overtaking us, and cast a critical eye on the impulse to preserve and the growing empire of preservation. In the model of GSD's goals, where the emphasis is on the construction of an alternative and sustainable future through design, ever conscious of the need to avoid conformity of tradition, Critical Conservation is not a preservation program. We propose instead that it is vital to keep culture alive, dynamic, and capable of meeting modern needs. We've established a critical position that puts into question why, what, and who determines the conservation-destruction balance. Our program seeks to empower a new generation of designers, planners, and real estate professionals, and a diverse range of other candidates from around the globe, with a foundation for understanding cultural systems, issues of culture, history, identity, and design that frame the conflicts inherent in the transformation of places over time. It's really our goal to empower our students to make nuanced decisions about conservation in complex urban and natural places. David Lowenthal's writings are the foundation of our theory courses. One of our outstanding students from the first Critical Conservation class, Natalia Escobar Castrillon, who is now an Aga Khan Fellow pursuing a doctorate at Harvard, was so engaged with Professor Lowenthal's work that she looked up his email address and sent him a message. Out of her initiative and his engaging response comes this evening.
Thank you very much, Susan, for these kind words. I first became familiar with Professor Lowenthal's work through Susan Snyder and George Thomas' seminar, Culture, Conservation, and Design. This seminar has become, in a few years, an outstanding contribution to the critical discussions on conservation at the GSD. And Professor Lowenthal's work has had a significant role on shaping this discourse. In one of his acclaimed books, The Past is a Foreign Country, Professor Lowenthal explains how and why we define and change the past to conform to present expectations or histories. In his article, Past Time, Present Place, he talks about the modern disease of nostalgia, or the need to idealize the past as an alternative to the failures of the present. In his article, Material Preservation and Its Alternatives, Lowenthal defines preservation as an illusion, and I quote, "Because material objects are continuously transformed, every stage in preservation forces choices among many valid but irreconcilable criteria. No preservation discussion is logically right or permanently appropriate." This critical reappraisal of the preservation field was inspirational and opened a new path for critical conservation. However, while Lowenthal's work became a crucial part of our education at the GSD, he remained mostly unaware of his contribution to this field. With a sense of curiosity and respect, I first contacted David Lowenthal 1 year ago and informed him of the existence of the program, of the repercussion of his writings, and kindly invited him to join our discussion in person. This email evolved into a year-long conversation that serves as proof of his commitment with education and the conservation field. Professor Lowenthal not only welcomed and accepted my invitation, but was open to share his latest contributions to the field and even to read and discuss my own work. This conversation reflected his broad knowledge, but also his kindness and engagement with the students as prospective practitioners and scholars, and David's care for the conservation discipline, past, present, and also future. And for all that, I would like to thank David Lowenthal for sharing his knowledge and time with me and with all of us today. Thank you very much.
I'm George Thomas, another of the three-headed monster that is critical conservation, and I want to welcome all of you to our evening with David Lowenthal, and also I want to specifically welcome David's many friends and admirers, many of whom are seated over in the sort of mid-zone, including his sister, who is a border collie grower and one of the great people in the world from our perspective as dog lovers. So just as an aside. David's work is foundational to what we're trying to do with critical conservation. That's really irritating. But tonight's lecture is brought to us, I'm getting a lot of feedback. Is that better? Okay. Tonight's lecture is presented by a fund that is specifically created to memorialize a major Boston figure from the 19th century, Sylvester Baxter. Baxter was the type of person that we would like to get our hands on in critical conservation, a person who approaches the world in all dimensions. He trained first as a journalist in the great age of journalism. He then studied city planning at Leipzig, and then came back and wrote on every topic from transportation, logistics, how trains moved milk and products to cities, the architecture of the Southwest, the first major book on Spanish colonial architecture, one topic after another. And at the same time engaged with Charles Eliot, who was the son of the president of Harvard, and began to come up with the idea of Greater Boston as a concept, and to see it as a totality that ought to relate and develop forms together. The chain of beautiful river parks are all part of Sylvester Baxter's vision. And so it seemed appropriate to us that this lecture would be brought to us by this remarkable Bostonian, who in an age when city planning often looked at big, simple, monumental plans, said that city planning shouldn't start with form, but rather from a thorough studying, quote, of all existing conditions. And again, that seems to be so important to the way we look at conservation and culture. Professor Lowenthal's interests span Sylvester Baxter's world and much more. After graduating from Harvard, and I realized it was a very different Harvard. It was a Harvard that was before women as students, not before women. But he graduated in 1943 from Harvard, served in World War II in the American Army, joined the U.S. State Department, and then from that vantage point began a career that took him first as a geographer, getting his master's at California, and then got his PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin, Frederick Jackson Turner's school that had created the frontier theory and so on. And David Lowenthal then took on one of those titanic figures who we still think about, study almost every week, it seems. He comes across our page, and that's, of course, George Perkins Marsh, who made the case that humanity was actually changing the world. This is a book that was published in 1864. David is here for a symposium that he is, I guess, basically the symposium on George Perkins Marsh. And we'll be lecturing and discussing and thinking about his contribution up in Vermont starting the day after tomorrow. But it seems to me, as I again skimmed Marsh and encounter his ideas, that corporations are amoral and that they aren't people and all the questions that we debate today, that the work that David took on, not advancing scholarship one footnote at a time, but advancing the world in big chunks. That's what David does that is so remarkable for all of us. His range of interests, his contributions, the groups that he advises cover the entire world from small island nations to SARC and UNESCO and on and on and on. And with those contributions, he brings a world to us that he's experienced, debated, discussed, and we're going to hear him tonight in his discussion of the issues of conservation, past and present. The other question that you should know is that when we talk to him, I'm I'm going to be honest here. We had some reservations about bringing a 91-year-old scholar to address this type of thing. And we started talking about the question of authenticity with him, and David came back. He said, well, in sort of Stephen Colbert's terms, like truthiness. And we said, this guy's right there. He's totally fine. So tonight's inquiry is especially appropriate at the GSD that had its beginning with Joseph Hudnut and his great hire, Walter Gropius, and that continues to the present with the faculty that Mohsen Mostafavi has created. In an age when more and more data can be crunched and more factoids can be discovered, the array of findable facts makes everything historic, running the risk of undermining orders of magnitude and raising the questions that Rem Koolhaas presented under the title of Chronochaos for the Venice Biennale. Koolhaas brought into sharp focus the conflict between the ambition of the global task force of preservation to rescue larger and larger territories of the planet, now some 12% of the inhabited zone, and the corresponding contemporary global rage to eliminate the evidence of the post-war period of architecture as a social product, of which this building that we're in is part. This inherent conflict results, in Rem's words, in, quote, the wrenching simultaneity of preservation and destruction that is destroying any sense of a linear evolution of time. Professor Lowenthal's topic tonight, conservation past and present, continues this discussion. Please join me in welcoming him, and then know that there will be time for questions and discussion after. David, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, and especially Natalia, George, and Susan for their generosity and kindness and hospitality in bringing me back here again to a very different Harvard than the one that Howard Hibbett and I graduated from really a long time ago, and different also from the Graduate School of Design that I taught in the mid to late 1960s before this building was built, and when I had the marvelous experience of working on this spot, because on this spot then was the Jared Sparks House. It's one of the most beautiful buildings on this campus and a superb working place. Different also because the idea of what students in the Graduate School of Design thought they should be doing has changed so much from then till now. Most of my students in landscape architecture were essentially garden designers. That was what they were aiming to do for the rest of their lives. They lived themselves in slums. Their design studio was chaotic, but they were designing magnificent places for the very wealthy. This is now a very different place. I'm sure there are the very wealthy, but the students whom I've talked with seem not to be concerned with that sort of thing anymore. Before I came here this time, I was given a task. I was given statement by George and Susan that conservation was no longer what it used to be, that critical conservation was something that now got rid of the old dichotomies between old and new, past and present, traditional and modern, all of those things that seemed to put conservation as a process of learning and a process of practice, to seem to put conservation in the camp of the old-fashioned, of the retrograde, of people who didn't want anything to change, and of people who believed that material preservation was the most important thing in the world, at least in the world of historic preservation, architectural preservation, and so on, and that conservation had changed. The conservation was now concerned with people more than with places and more than with objects. Whether this is entirely true is another matter, but that is the set of issues that I really want to engage with this evening. I want to consider, in the first place, whether these outdated dichotomies are really all that outdated or not. Traditional, modern, for example. Well, there is a conflict between what we do with the traditional and what we do with the modern. I have taught for some time in London, especially to architects and designers, and I made it a habit to bring to my lectures and classes as many practitioners as I could, so that the students would get some sense not only of the theory, the history, the methodology, the notion, the scholastic notion of the topic, but would see what the real world problems were and how people dealt with them in the real world. I had no money to give these people, but I usually got them a good lunch and enough wine so that they would open up properly without inhibitions. One day I brought the secretary for SPAB, Society of the Protection of Ancient Buildings, which had been founded by William Morris in the 1870s. William Morris believed, like many others of his time, John Ruskin in particular, that one should never try to restore a building, that restoration was a lie, an impossibility, that what you needed to do with old buildings was to allow them gently to expire, give them only daily care, never restore. And this became a pledge that in order to join the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, one had to sign the pledge, never to restore anything. And it still is a pledge that people have to sign in order to do this. After he said this, one of the students said, well, that's all very well for ancient buildings, but what about modern buildings? Oh, no, nothing of the sort. Nothing to do with modern buildings. Oh, said the student, where do you draw the line? Right away, he said, 1923. I asked him afterwards how he came so rapidly to that conclusion and why he chose that year. He said, well, he had me. There is no difference between ancient and modern. It's all a matter of degree. But I would lose all credibility if I didn't come up with a date. So I chose one far enough back so that he could not have been born at that time, and yet recent enough so that he would understand something about it. This was the truth. Conservation involves both the past and the future, as well as the present, and I want to talk more about that as I go on. The other distinction that George and Susan warned me about was the distinction between us and them. This is a whole wholly different topic, which I wish I could spend the rest of the evening on. But I want to say only this about us and them, that my work over the past half-century has involved the study of heritage, not only architectural heritage, but memory work of all kinds, the kinds of things that we revere, take over from the past. But all of these are, in fact, quarrels between us and them. Heritage is essentially a matter of the difference between us and them. Heritage originated with the Tower of Babel, with God's displeasure at human desires to become godlike. And he dispersed the humans into their different tribes with their different languages so that they became incommunicable. And having become incommunicable, they then developed each their own set of notions about where they came from, what mattered to them in their past, what was ancestral, what was different about them from their neighbors, so that much in the realm of heritage, and then necessarily of conservation, depends upon quarrels between us and them. And I'll say something more about that, too, as I go on. It's an unfortunate fact in the days that we like to think of universal heritage as an important matter, indeed a crucial matter, but it is nevertheless something that we have to conjure with, how to get over the conflict between us and them. So I will talk first about why I think we should conserve. Then I will say something about why we should not conserve. And then I wanted to discuss some of the dilemmas that arise from those two different ways of thinking about things. First of all, I think we have to conserve because conservation is innate to the human being. It's innate to human nature. We're pack rats by nature. We store things, we pile things up, we collect, we save, we hoard things. Why do we do this? Because we have learned that we need to do this in order to survive. We need to do this in order to survive physically. We need to do it in order to survive mentally in terms of memory. And we define ourselves by our possessions. Historians and philosophers from Herder to William James and beyond have continually noted how people tend to speak of themselves in terms of what they own. I am what I own, as William James said, and then he listed a whole set of categories which today would seem old-fashioned to most of us: yachts, bank accounts, wives, children, and so on. But the ownership of all of these things is what makes us what we are in many ways. Secondly, I think we have to conserve because we need both the past and we need to conserve for the future in order to ensure that the present has meaning. The sociologist Durkheim pointed out that we come into this world living in houses that we did not build, speaking languages that we did not invent, using tools that we did not create, developing all kinds of things on the basis of what was given to us. That each of us is, in fact, the inheritor of millions of years of DNA, of thousands or tens of thousands of years of civilized humanity's history, of tens of thousands of hours of our own life history. All of these things underlie everything we do and are essential to our lives. We could not survive without them. So conservation is not only innate, psychologically speaking, It's imperative biologically and otherwise as an aspect of our being. There's no escaping it. Thirdly, we preserve, and I think we need to preserve, because we need to feel good. We need to take pride in roots. We need to protect what we value. We need to ensure that things that we love do not decay or fall ill or die as long as possible. We need sometimes to go beyond this. This is why plunder becomes such an important element of human history. Fourthly, and perhaps less substantially, but nevertheless importantly, we conserve because we try to save things for some larger purpose than for ourselves. Perhaps this is best expressed in the phrase pro patria mori. Dulce and decorum est pro patria mori. We serve, it is sweet to die for one's country. This is not simply a patriotic slogan. It is a definition of what it is to be human in terms of working for a cause that goes beyond our individual selves, whether it's our descendants, whether it's our neighbors, whether it's our fellow countrymen, whether it's the world as a whole. Life has meaning only, mostly, on the basis of going beyond the individuals that we are and the brevity of the lifespans that we have. Finally, we invest much of this conservation activity in things and objects and buildings, as well as in memories and in other people, because we feel that things do not die the same death that we do, that they outlast us, and that they should outlast us. It was Forbes, Edward W. Forbes, who was the first conservator at the Fogg Art Museum, who made the statement that he believed that the Dresden Madonna, the great figure, was it the Dresden Madonna, or have I got that wrong? No, it was the Sistine Chapel that he was talking about. The Sistine Chapel deserved conservation more than any human being, because human beings were inevitably mortal, and they were succeeded by other human beings, whereas there was only one Sistine Chapel, and there never could be another. Others have elaborated on this theme. Harold Nicolson, the great English diarist and statesman, to the effect that he would be willing to be put up before a firing squad and shot if he could save the great art masterpieces and sculptural masterpieces of his tradition. He would give up his two sons for the sake of saving a Rembrandt. Not everybody would go so far, but there is a continual tension between our sense of our own mortality and of the desire to ensure that things that have inspired us all our lives should continue to inspire, continue to survive, to inspire future generations. as Nicholson put it, I can get another baby any day, but I can never get another Raphael. Well, if those are some reasons for conserving, what are the reasons for not conserving? There are many. First of all, we have to recognize that it's not just people who die, everything dies. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is eternal. The old Christian dichotomy between time and eternity was based on a notion of an afterlife that was eternal, but it was an afterlife somewhere else, not on this terrestrial globe. That notion of eternity is sometimes applied by conservators to the objects that they love, and yet they know that there is no way of holding off their eventual demise. So if nothing survives forever, we need to recognize that the notion of being able to keep them for eternity is in itself a sickness. It's a delusion. It's a delusion that's explored in a book that's just recently been published by Stephen Cairns called, a book that's been published by Stephen Cairns and Jane Jacobs called Buildings Must Die, a description of the life of buildings in terms of an awareness that we not only look at buildings in terms of what they're like when they're first constructed, and as Ruskin put it, as what they're going to look like in 100 years' time or 200 years' time, but as ruins, and eventually as nothing at all, since everything perishes. All changes. Everything that's created is created out of the ruin of something else, so that the father is the ruin of the parent is the ruin of the child. The butterfly is the ruin of the chrysalis. Everything changes, everything becomes a metamorphosis. Secondly, I think we need not conserve because the notion that cultural heritage is limited in the way that I was describing earlier is not entirely true. It's not even remotely true, because we're continually creating new heritage, new precious objects, new valuable structures, new entire landscapes, new memories, which replace the old ones as the old ones become less significant or vanish entirely from view. These are not like fossil fuels, never to be created again in large measures. Thirdly, and connected with what I've just mentioned, we conserve because conservation and preservation are inevitably part of a double development. Conservation entails destruction, partly because, in the material world at least, one can never go on creating without destroying. There's not enough space. The same holds true with memories. All memories decay, old memories are replaced to a considerable degree by new memories. Old ideals are replaced by revised ones and new ones. Everything is therefore malleable in a certain sense. Fourthly, I think we need not conserve because we have a need frequently to banish the past. It hurts too much, or it's too tragic, or it becomes suffocating as a presence, preventing innovation, stifling creativity, making it difficult for us to create new things, new ideas, new notions of how to improve the world or to save, or even to save the world. We need psychologically to make our own mark on the world, not only retain the marks of those who went before us. As Václav Havel put it in one of his books, I need to be convinced that my existence has ruffled the surface of the world of being. That after my little ripple, however marginal, however insignificant, however ephemeral it is, that being is and always will be different from what was before. Each of us is unique. Each of us must make a difference in the world in some measure. Sixth, I think that we need not conserve or ought not conserve too much, because we have to face the fact that we're continually dealing with new circumstances, new environments, new landscapes, new climates. Think of climate change as an example. We cannot simply go on with our old ideas, our old notions, our old buildings, even our old landscapes, because inevitably these are shifting, changing, both environmentally and in terms of the ideas of the new generations who succeed each other. And we have to be capable of taking on board the changes in the circumstances that impinge on us in order to deal with new things as well as with old ones. In all of these contexts, what comes to mind is the complaint of the inhabitants of the city of Dijon, France, a generation ago, when they were told that the French government had in mind to conserve the city as a wonderful historical site. And the citizens of Dijon rose up and said, "Don't save the stones, save us. We're what matters in this place. If you save the stones and leave us behind, you have nothing but a mortuary left." This is the kind of thing that I think Rem Koolhaas means when Rem Koolhaas complains about preservation and conservation as not only a stifling and a suffocating force, but as an evil, a metastasizing cancer, which not only covers too large a proportion of the globe, but keeps in place monuments to all of the excesses and evils of the world, that the pyramids, after all, reek of absolutism, that the Versailles reeks of an outworn and tarnished regime, that every great monument you can think of has its roots in slavery, that the Old Testament has its roots in bloodlust and sexism. One can hardly think of a major structure that is not conceived in some kind of evil. The magazine, The Onion, the newspaper, The Onion, conceived of a major monument, which nobody had heard of before, as the eighth wonder of the world, as an expression of the repressiveness of conservation. Repressiveness of conservation, which in England has gone so far that we no longer use the word at all. And when Prime Minister Tony Blair came to power, his minders made sure that he never stood in front of an ancient monument, lest people feel that he was out of touch. But the Onion's description of this great monument is something that I want to quote briefly, that the World Heritage Organization was saluting the new gap, the old gap between the rich and the poor, as the most colossal and enduring of mankind's creations, that it was a vast chasm that stretches across most of the inhabited world, by far the largest man-made structure on Earth. This was an astounding feat of human engineering that eclipsed the Great Wall of China, the pyramids of Giza, and perhaps even the great racial divide. Untold millions of slaves and serfs had toiled their whole lives to complete the gap between the rich and the poor, starting over 10,000 years ago, when the landed elites first convinced the subjects that the monument was the divine will of God. And the small groups of dedicated industrialists have managed to widen and deepen this gap ever since, to make it a permanent feature of the globe. Finally, I want to say that I think oblivion is not only desirable, but necessary in many cases. It was the reasoning that led people like Thomas Hobbes and Ernest Renan to talk about the necessity for nations to forget much of their past in order to be able to cope in the present and the future with divisions that were no longer going to tear the nation apart. Hobbes in the 17th century, Renan in the 19th century, noted that in order for Britain and France to overcome the terrible events, the terrible memories of the histories that had divided them previously, they would have to forget what had happened. I need not say that this is a greater and more evident truth today in places like the Balkans, as it was most recently in Ireland, which developed the theory of mope. We must mope. The most oppressed nation ever. Every country that I can think of has thought of itself in terms of having been more oppressed than every other country. Unfortunately, the notion of having been deprived in the past becomes a vital force in depriving others in the future. So in order to recover from these illnesses, one must forget, as far as possible, the divisions of the past. Time has changed the balance between conserving and deciding not to conserve, as it has between some of the other divisions that I mentioned, the traditional and the innovative. It was Socrates who said that all discovery is mere recollection. It was the Christians, the early Christians, who first developed the essential notion that change was heretical. Change should not occur. Change must be denied. Change was, in a sense, a sin against God. This notion survived in Christianity right through the Reformation, taken on board by the Protestants over against the Catholics in terms of we have to change in order to get back to what things were like originally. But the notion of getting back to an original and the undesirability of change was the underlying cardinal principle behind much of the Christian tradition. Nor not only the Christian tradition, for that matter, but particularly within the Christian tradition. Change was so abominable that people who were making change continually pretended not to be doing so. This is particularly true in the period of the Reformation, when men like Erasmus were continually claiming never to have changed anything, but only returning to some first principle. I'm not inventing anything, Erasmus said. I'm going back to first principles. I'm restoring what used to be. And people actually persuaded themselves that this was the case, that this is what they were actually doing. At other times, people would say, we believe in change, but we can't ever do it because there is no such thing as an original, as Emerson put it. There is no originality in originals even. It's all copying back to the archangels. And nothing is new on this planet. And so it was that people frequently denied change while doing it, or denied stability while actually trying to undertake it. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of late Victorian and Edwardian England in this period of very profound change was the attachment to the past among the aristocracy, the landed gentry, and the new industrialists, who, as Keynes put it, never believed in jam today. It was only jam yesterday and jam tomorrow. They were so concerned with their ancestors and their descendants that they entailed their houses for generation after generation. They kept their houses full of the portraits of their ancestors. They lived with their ancestors. They planted trees that only their great-grandchildren would see coming into full bloom. They rented premises on 99-year leases that only their great-great-grandchildren would come into the benefit of. And yet these were some of the most change-worthy and progressive figures in the history of recent times. It was also the period in which the great classical historian Francis Cornford wrote his wonderful book for young academic entrepreneurs about how to cope with Cambridge and Oxford. The book is called Microcosmographia Academica, a primer for young dons about how to ensure that change never took place. If anything was ever suggested in the way of a reform, you could fall back on various principles. First of all, that this was a wonderful idea, but the time was not yet ripe for it. Secondly, that it might be a good idea, but it would set a dangerous precedent. There are all kinds, 4 or 5 such principles, which ensured together that nothing was ever done for the first time. I discovered when I began to live in England that this was still essentially adhered to as a policy. I had an occasion to go and visit the library at All Souls College in Oxford to look up a will of its founder, Christopher Codrington, who'd been a planter in the West Indies, in one of whose islands I was studying. I corresponded for months with the librarian, and he invited me to come and visit, which I did. Seated me at a Dickensian desk, brought me the will and various other papers, and he came back 20 minutes later and said, "By the way, you've used this library before, haven't you?" And I said, "No, I haven't." He said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Then you can't use it now, I'm afraid." I said, "How does anybody ever use it for the first time?" He said, "Well, if you know a fellow from All Souls." Well, I did know a fellow. He had to be hauled out of tea in order to identify me, in spite of the fact that I've been corresponding. The problem with much of the world in which I work, the world of heritage conservation, is that everybody understands some of these principles about why we should not conserve everything, but very few people dare to say so, because heritage is such a sacred cow that nobody dares to cull things. The only people I know who regularly get rid of stuff fast are the archivists, because they're inundated with things which they're forced to take, and they know they can't keep it all because there's not enough space. So they make it a rule, 2% of what we get. That's all we can keep. If only the architects and the architectural historians thought the same way, how much better off we might be. That said, there are risks in not conserving that I haven't mentioned, and they're apparent, I think, to everybody. If you change too fast and too much, you lose the groundwork of memory, you lose the groundwork of affection that has been built up over time for things, for ideas, and for people as well. So it's easy to tear things down, and it can be done quite rapidly. The iconoclasts are always with us, and they work fast. it takes a much longer time to build things than to destroy them. The destruction of languages, ongoing destruction of languages, is one of these realms in which we don't create new languages fast enough to keep up with the pace of the destruction of the old ones. And the old ones embody and embed a whole world of vital differences that we need to bear in mind as we move forward into a world that isn't ever going to be wholly uniform or wholly at one. So I agree here essentially with that arch conservative Edmund Burke, who said in his book on the French Revolution that society has to be a compact between the living, a compact also between the living and those who are dead, and also a compact with those who are not yet born, because society is not created in an instant. It's a creation that requires generations of time. Most human institutions, many human artifacts, most human structures require more than one generation. If we don't remember this, we're fated to live in evanescence, and as Burke put it again, like insects who live only a day. I want to say a few words about what I think are vital new developments that are changing our attitude towards both construction, towards both conservation and destruction. I'm not going to say much about any of them because I've run out of time, but I want to mention them as hopeful signs for a future. One is the fact that science has become historical, that we see the whole world and not just humanity in terms of historical change, that we understand that the cosmos has a history, that the earth has a history, that life has a history, that everything is contingent in the way that human history is, even if it's not intentional, that it's contingent and therefore non-predictable, non-stochastic, something that one cannot know ahead of time. We don't know what is going to happen in the future. We don't even know what is possible in the future. And we need to bear in mind continually the fact that we are creatures of not only the uncertainties of time, but of the uncertainties of our own making within time as we move ahead in changing the environment, in changing our culture, in changing our history. That every time we make changes, every time we conserve, because conservation is also a way of making a change, every time we act on anything, we are altering the fabric of the future in unpredictable ways. Why do I say this is hopeful? I think it's hopeful because it prevents the engineers from doing us down, from doing us in, from planning a world that is essentially unlivable, unusable, and unhuman. Secondly, I suggest that we're understanding ecology and nature better than we used to, and we're more and more aware of the human impact, that we live in what has been called the Anthropocene, the world, the frame of time following on the geological eras of the past, an awareness that humans have been changing the world, and indeed the cosmos, for all we know, for millions, if not for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. First as hunters and gatherers with fire, then as industrialists and miners, then with the bomb and the knowledge that we can destroy not only all humanity, but all life, if we're unfortunate. And finally, with the knowledge that we can actually do something about this if we put our minds and our hearts to it enough. And this is a new awareness, a relatively new awareness of the past half century. Thirdly, within the world of design, and this is after all the design school, it seems to me that there's been a sea change in the way people are looking at buildings, objects, landscapes. That is to say, thinking of them not as permanent, but as ever-changing and as ever creating and recreating as we go along, so that we are not concerned only with the origin of something or what an original or best state of something is, but we're concerned with a structure, a building, a work of art, a people, as they go through life, as they go through time. And the conservators in particular are well aware now that conservation is never forever. There's never a stopping point. Once begun, conservation must go on and on and on, not only because the circumstances around an object or a memory keep changing, but because the attitudes of the people using it keep changing, so that the sense of a palimpsest has overtaken the notion of any sort of permanent structure. Everything is in flux and is handled as known to be in flux. Finally, an increasing awareness, it seems to me, that conservation is about people as well as things and cities, sites and cities, that we are concerned with the differences between them and us, with the differences between migrants and people in place, with the differences between the elderly and the young, with the differences between people in different cultures, with the differences between all the things that make change both difficult and necessary. And that we need to take on board the history of these changes as we go along, in the way we deal with the objects, the buildings, the landscapes, and the memories that have embedded those changes. A colleague of mine has written about South Africa House in London. South Africa House was conceived during apartheid times as a kind of monument to the virtues of slavery. and to the virtues of the rule of white over black. And when the regime changed and apartheid ended in South Africa, the new regime came in and said, we've got to sweep all this terrible stuff away. An English heritage, which rules what happens to structures, to buildings in Britain, came and took a look and said, you can't change this. It's a listed building. And everything in and around it is precious. It cannot be taken away. So what did they do? They kept it all, and they overlaid it with new things, so that on top of the old mural that extols the virtues of slavery are now pinned in a palimpsest fashion the documents of the beatings the slaves received, of the costs of the sale of the slaves, and of the various other objects of more recent times. And the notion that you don't take away the monuments of the past because you no longer agree with the sentiments that they espoused has been overtaken by the notion, yes, we keep those and we add on to them the recent history that shows that we no longer believe these things, that every monument really ideally ought to contain a history of the paradoxes, not just the virtues that it entails. I remember at Penn State when the Joe Paterno statue was removed last year after the outcry of Paterno's turning a blind eye to child abuse, and the statue was taken away. What a missed opportunity. They should have had another statue behind it of Mephistopheles looking over the shoulder of Paterno and telling him things, or at least writing within the possibilities of the statue. So let us retain all of our memories as far as we can. Let us retain the structures that we have, but go on adding to them, changing them as we go along, and making it possible for the conservation of the past to be part of the conservation of the future, and not something that simply has to be abolished so that the past can become the future. Thank you.
The original format of this was going to be maybe a discussion with David and a group, and then David sent us a note saying, I've got so much to say, we don't have time for that. So I want to thank him for an extraordinary compilation, distillation of the ideas that we all find so interesting and so important. I'm assuming that in this audience there are a few people who would like to raise their hands and ask questions. There are mics. Please take him on.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm taking you on, but I have an observation and then a kind of a question. The observation is when you were talking about Václav Havel, I found myself thinking about, and I don't know to the extent to which this is actually true, but the sort of notion about the Native American people that they would move through a landscape without leaving a trace. And I guess I just offer that as an observation of a different way of living without the need to have monuments and maybe other artifacts. I'm not sure what that suggests, but the question is, and you touched on it at the very end, I found myself thinking about two statues. One, a statue of Nathan Forrest in Memphis, Tennessee, which a friend of mine who founded the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel, so he's interested in conservation, is interested in getting rid of. And the statue to the White League in New Orleans, that the compromise solution was to surround it with walls that are sort of part of a transportation infrastructure. And it sort of brings the question, so how do you decide? How do you decide which of these monuments might be, not, in the 2%, and yeah, it's time to get rid of them, and which are ones that could be adapted in the interesting ways that you suggest? And I don't know, obviously there's no easy answer, but.
Hugely difficult problem, especially when there are so many monuments. Look at the Washington Mall. There are so many monuments on it now that there's hardly room for anything else. So what do we do about all the new ones that we need? The monument to women has not yet been even thought about enough to come. The monument, other monuments have, but everybody needs to have the monument on the mall because it's the most important place. So I agree that this is a problem of space, and it can't always be solved by the palimpsest notion. I think that Maya Lin's monument has been hugely successful, partly because it is a space rather than a structure for the most part. But I did want to comment on what you said about moving silently through the forest. This was a notion developed by mostly whites who wanted to take Indian land. And they could do so more easily if they were able to say that Indians didn't really live on the land, but just move through it. And especially that Indians were not sedentary women. So it became part of a mythology that some circles is seen to celebrate the Indian, but actually was originally invented to denigrate the Indian and get rid of them. Is this a conservation? Thank you.
Thank you for a fantastic talk. I hope that if I make the age of 91, I can be as sprightly and insightful as you. To pick up on the South Africa House example, the South Africa House in London example, I'm not sure if you're aware, but one of the faculty here, Christoph Wodzitzko, projected onto the South Africa House a swastika during the time of apartheid, which was a very powerful statement about the perception of the building at the time. So the big question you speak a lot about the object, the artifact, and not so much about the way in which something is inscribed within social practices, within a subjective viewpoint. And I guess I'm thinking here of the work of Homi Bhabha. I mean, you came from here went to the UK. Homi Bhabha came from the UK to Harvard. And Homi Bhabha always thinks about culture in terms of the object inscribed within a subjective practice of some kind. And once you take that into account, the artifact is never the same artifact once it's inscribed within a different social setting, a different subjective practice. The Berlin Wall is never the Berlin Wall after the fall of communism. It just becomes a monument to the Berlin Wall. And equally, I guess, with the South Africa House, you haven't got to even add anything to it. Already through the gaze, we are, in a subjective way, recoding what that physical artifact is. Is that fair?
Yes, I think this can perhaps be more easily done when you destroy an object and preserve the fragments, as is the case with the Berlin Wall, or was the case originally with in the French Revolution. There's a long history. And the fragments of the Berlin Wall have been turned into different kinds of memoria than they were originally. But then take the Pantheon in Paris. This has been through so many metamorphoses of meaning that you could almost take it as an object lesson in the differences of what it has meant to many. And of course, there's the problem of the building that originally is intact and then falls into ruin and becomes appreciated as a ruin, but not necessarily as a ruin in terms of the morality of decay or its aesthetic qualities or of its links to a dead past, which one remembers some degree of aversion and some degree of affection.
As a historian, first thing I'd like to do, thank you for the wonderful talk, but also thank you for your wonderful work. Your book has inspired me for many years. I would like to ask you to reflect on something I'm sure you've thought much about, which is the element of fiction in conservation, in memory. There's so many examples of monuments to people who didn't live, to cultural events that celebrate something that distorts what the actual facts are. And it builds on what people have been talking about here, the use of the past and sometimes the present to forward certain memories, even if those memories might be invented.
Fiction is highly desirable. I think I've written about the fictitious Three Kings. For those of you who haven't read this is, to me, a wonderful object lesson in the desirability of relics that don't exist. The Three Kings were among the relics supposedly discovered by Helena, who was the greatest archaeologist in the world. Since centuries after things happened, she was able to find the sites and the relics of various saints, aspects of the crucifixion, and so on. But among these were the relics of the three so-called Three Kings, which were carried to Milan in an ox cart by Saint Eustorgia and deposited there in a church. Centuries later, when the Saxons came to Milan and pillaged the place, Archbishop Reinald of Cologne was among the pillagers, and he did such a good job that he was given his choice of relics to take back, and he decided to take the Three Kings, among other relics, where they managed to get them back despite the papal forces that followed him, tried to recover them, and they were deposited in Cologne and eventually in the new cathedral, where they became the site of the Holy Roman Emperor. The first visit made after the coronation was to the relics of the Three Kings. About a century or so later, the Milanese began to protest that they'd been robbed and they wanted them back. Why did it take them so long? It took them so long because there were no Three Kings. This was all an invention by Reinald in order to make Cologne Cathedral important. Well, they did send something back to Milan, but it wasn't the Three Kings, of course. So the Three Kings are an example of a fiction that proved useful both to Milan, both to Cologne, and eventually also to Milan and to Florence, because the celebration of the Three Kings became so important in both of those cities afterwards. So fiction matters, but it's not only the funny aspects of fiction that matter, it's fiction that enables us to understand how things work. I was going to cite the example of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. Some of you must be familiar with that wonderful book, but his description of the city of Clarice is one in which here's a city that continually burgeons and then decays, gets rich and then gets poor. And when it's poor, people use all of the wonderful objects, the great ornaments, for mundane purposes. I'll just cite this example of one of these things. They would take the brocade curtains, they ended up as sheets. In marble funerary urns, they planted basil. Wrought iron gratings torn from the harem windows were used for roasting cat's meat on fires of inlaid wood. And he describes this new Clarice as one which has used the old Clarice in different ways, and then Clarice begins to prosper again, and all of these things are rescued and put in museums and changed again, but they serve a different purpose, but they're new. They're the same objects in a certain sense, serving a completely new purpose. But it's from works like Calvino's that one gets a sense of how things actually function in the real world, perhaps even better than from actual histories because of their vividness.
Hello, thank you. I am coming from the critical conservation concentration, and I'll have the chance to elaborate more with you tomorrow. So, but I have to ask this because you said some things that rang all my bells, and I had to share. You said, I think you were quoting Hope saying that one must forget, and especially nations must forget. And I come from a country, Israel. I think we have the highest rate of citizens and monuments, and I think it's true. And the people who conceived the idea and started this thing called Israel. They were basing it on the memory of the Holocaust. And every year around April or May, thousands of kids from high schools all over the country are shipping toward, it's not a good word to say, but are going to tour the camps of Poland. And the one thing that is always there, and they're always being told, is that you have to remember and never forget. That's the sentence that every kid knows and every kid grows up with, and it serves a lot of notions and national notions. Well, to make things short, the question is, when is the right time to forget? In national landscape, my grandmother never let me go. She wants me to forget. So that's the question.
Hugely important and almost unanswerable question, which I hope we can begin to discuss tomorrow. The example of the Holocaust is one that has profoundly affected the whole course of not just history, but the way in which history is taught, because it has made memory so important. The memory of the great French historian Pierre Nora, in his 7-volume survey of French heritage, Lieux de Mémoire, started out in 1984, the first volume, says, the thing about history and memory is, with such wonderful historians and history, the history is overtaking memory, conquering memory, that memory is essentially less significant than history in terms of how people think about the past. 8 years later, when by this time the Holocaust had become hugely important globally in terms of its salience, and memories of the Holocaust had become so profoundly important in global governance, the sense of injustice, influencing practically every reparation movement since then. Nora reversed his opinion, said now memory is flooding history, and history is practically no more because we are all saturated in Holocaust memory and similar barbaric memory, to the point that the immediacy of memory is impinging on the objectivity or distancing that history provides. So that's just an introduction to, not an answer to your question. I suppose in Yugoslavia, I would say that let us get rid of the 14th century, if we can. Partly because living memory and history are different in each place, but the 14th century is far enough back so that one doesn't really have the word from one's grandparents or even great-grandparents anymore. But I won't say 1923.
Thanks very much for your talk, David. Extremely fascinating. My question is about extinction. You spoke in terms of your outlooks on conservation and preservation that ecology is enabling us a form of understanding of how to be able to engage the future. And I'm wondering, amidst the sites, cities, and even to a certain extent species that you've discussed as part of your talk, whether or not one of the pathways towards understanding how to be able to potentially farm this future, I don't know if you would necessarily qualify it that way, but if you were to farm this future, that designers in many respects need to understand how they can not only prevent extinction, but then also see the enabling possibilities of potentially multiplying these species. And I'm just wondering your views in terms of both bringing up the era of Anthropocene vis-a-vis also extinction of species as a result of industrialism. How do you see designers from the whole gamut, planners, architects, policymakers, how do they engage the futurism of conservation that you're proposing?
I take it that you're referring essentially to nature and ecology, and this is an ecological question.
That's correct.
Yes. It seems to me that what's happening in this field is that many ecologists and many who are concerned about the rate of change in nature on account of climate change and on account of human action generally in terms of the extinction of other creatures, is that increasingly ecologists tend not to think in terms of species, but in terms of ecosystems, or indeed in terms of the general principle underlying evolution. And that the principle underlying evolution is that it should be allowed to continue as it does in nature, rather than by a designed engineering process which carries many risks that have not been examined sufficiently. but that the notion of species conservation is an outdated one to some extent. It's, however, an essential one in terms of engaging public support, because the public is not going to massively be interested in the salvation of ecosystems when they can think of saving the wolf.
I want to thank David for just an extraordinary evening. We obviously need to have him back many more times, and we will start working on that immediately. But give him a round of applause and thank all of you.